On Whitaker Street, in the historic heart of Savannah, the little bakery sat in silence. The refrigeration unit hummed low and steady, filling the empty space with its mechanical breath. Beyond the glass cases, where there should have been trays of pastries, pies, and frosted cakes, only a few lonely leftovers remained. A pair of eclairs she hadn't had the heart to throw out, a small tart that hadn't found a home. Their presence under the fluorescent lights felt almost mocking, as if reminding her how far her dream had fallen. Claire Bennett wiped down the shelves with a vinegar-based cleaner that smelled faintly acidic, harsher than butter and sugar ever should. Each stroke of the cloth seemed heavier than the last. She glanced up at the chalkboard menu, where whimsical handwriting once promised sweet moments to anyone passing by. Now the chalk marks were faint, smudged by time and indifference, like the dream itself. It had been 2 years since she'd opened the bakery. 2 years since she convinced herself that Savannah's locals and tourists alike would flock to her red velvets, her lemon bars, her pecan pies. She pictured children laughing with frosting on their lips, couples sharing slices beneath the moss-draped oaks outside. Instead, she got silence broken only by the occasional beep of the square reader tallying a meager sale. The landlord's letters had grown sharper, more impatient. The last one hadn't even bothered with pleasantries, just a demand, blunt and final. The bank's emails were worse, bolded reminders, phrases like final notice that pressed down on her chest each time she opened her inbox. Suppliers had been kind at first, giving her grace weeks and extra time, but even kindness had its limits. Claire touched the crack in the corner of the front display glass, the one she had noticed the very first week she opened. Back then, it felt like nothing, a minor accident when a delivery box clipped the edge. But in her mind, that fracture had grown over the months, no longer just in the glass, but deep inside her confidence. A tiny fault line that spread until the whole foundation felt unstable. She turned off the overhead lights, leaving the kitchen glow as the only source of warmth. The stainless steel counters caught the soft reflection, transforming into something less clinical, more forgiving. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine she wasn't a failing business owner, but simply a baker, a woman with flour on her apron and hope in her chest. But the numbers were undeniable. The weekend ahead was her silent deadline. If nothing changed, if no miracle arrived, she would call her landlord Monday morning. She would surrender the keys and tell herself it wasn't failure, just a break. Americans liked softer words. She knew better. It would be the end. Claire leaned back against the counter, closed her eyes, and remembered opening day. The scent of cinnamon rolls, fresh from the oven, had wafted through the street. A few curious passers-by had come in, charmed by the chalkboard signs and her nervous smile. She remembered telling herself, "This is it. This is where I belong." For weeks, she lived on adrenaline and caffeine, certain her dream was unstoppable. But dreams wore down against rent, against slow winters, against bills that didn't wait for inspiration. Each month had chipped away at her resolve until only exhaustion was left. She ran the cloth over the glass once more, staring at the hollow reflections staring back at her. Her grandmother had always told her that baking was about making people feel cared for. But lately, the bakery had felt more like a burden than a gift, an anchor that dragged her further down each day. She sighed and dropped the rag onto the counter. If nothing else, tonight she could at least walk out with clean shelves. Maybe that would make saying goodbye easier. Just then, the bell over the door chimed. The sound startled her so much that she nearly knocked over the napkin holder. Customers at this hour were rare, almost non-existent. She turned quickly, expecting perhaps a lost tourist or someone drunk and wandering. But the figure in the doorway was neither. An elderly man stood framed in the entrance, holding the door with a trembling hand. He wore a tweed overcoat that looked as though it belonged to another era, something pulled straight from an old photograph. His face carried the lines of dignity worn thin by worry, and his pale blue eyes held something desperate, something raw. "Excuse me," he said, voice gravelly but urgent. Are you still open? Claire blinked, unsure how to answer. Technically, she wasn't. Technically, she hadn't been open for hours. Yet something about the way he hovered there, clutching the frame of the door as though his whole night depended on it, kept her from sending him away. I'm sorry, she said gently, her tired voice stretching into kindness. We're just about closed. The man stepped inside, closing the door carefully behind him. The bell jingled once more before settling into silence. He removed a handkerchief from his pocket and held it like a talisman. My name's Thomas Montgomery, he said, his words tumbling out with urgency. Tomorrow is my wife's 80th birthday. We've been married 55 years. And his voice faltered. He lowered his gaze to the floor, ashamed. I forgot to order her cake. Claire's breath caught. He stood there, not as a customer, but as a husband heavy with guilt. She could feel the weight of his words filling the empty shop, pressing against the silence that had lived there for months. For the first time in a long while, Claire felt her heart quicken, not for rent or overdue bills, but for the quiet desperation of a stranger asking her for one last chance. Thomas Montgomery stood in the glow of the bakery's lights, his weathered hand still gripping the handkerchief as though it anchored him. Claire watched him, sensing not just the exhaustion of an old man, but the panic of someone who had realized too late that he had forgotten something irreplaceable. I don't know how I let this happen, he murmured, his voice unsteady. Tomorrow is my wife's birthday, 80 years old. We've been married 55 years. He paused, swallowing hard as if the words themselves were difficult to admit. And I forgot the cake. His confession hung in the air like a verdict. Claire said nothing at first. She had grown used to customers asking for last-minute favors. Dozens of cupcakes for a school event, a pie just before Thanksgiving. But never had she heard it spoken like this, with shame pressing down heavier than the request itself. I walked half this city tonight, Thomas continued, his eyes darting as though retracing his frantic steps. I went to every bakery I could find. Most were already closed, and those still open said no. They told me I should have ordered weeks ago, that nothing could be done on such short notice. And they were right. His voice cracked. But I can't show up tomorrow empty-handed. Not after everything she's endured this year. The mention of his wife softened his tone. Claire saw the way his fingers trembled against the edge of the counter. Her name is Evelyn, he said, his gaze brightening with memory. She's been in and out of the hospital all year. Heart trouble, the kind that makes you count breaths at night instead of sheep. I've spent so much time managing her medicine, her appointments, watching her fall asleep with tubes and monitors, that he faltered again. I lost track of this one thing. And she loves her birthday cake. She always has. He opened the handkerchief, revealing a crumpled piece of paper with notes scrawled in shaky handwriting. It doesn't need to be grand. No 3 tiers, no showpieces, just red velvet, with cream cheese frosting. And he hesitated, embarrassed by the simplicity of it. A single rose, a sugar rose right in the center. She always says a cake isn't dressed without one. The request was so modest, so heartfelt, that Claire felt something stir inside her chest. It had been so long since a customer asked for anything other than flavors on a menu board. She saw in his eyes not just a man desperate for dessert, but a husband desperate to give his wife one more moment of joy. But reality was quick to intrude. She thought of her pantry shelves. Flour, sugar, eggs, yes. Cocoa, yes. But cream cheese? Butter? Vanilla beans? She had rationed everything, saving what little remained as though hoarding them would delay the inevitable. Her last block of cream cheese sat in the refrigerator, intended for a cake she might never sell. Her last 2 vanilla beans had been tucked away for months, labeled in her mind as for something special. This man's plea made her wonder. What else could special mean if not this? Still, hesitation gnawed at her. She had already promised herself she would close by Monday. Why take on more work now, more hours without sleep, more strain on ingredients she might never replace? Thomas must have read the conflict in her silence. He fumbled for his wallet, pulling it out with trembling hands. Please, I'll pay whatever you ask. Tonight, right now. Just name the price. Claire shook her head slowly. No, she said softly, surprising even herself with the steadiness in her voice. If I make this cake, you'll pay me tomorrow. When you see it, if it's what you hoped for. His eyes widened, disbelief flickering into relief. For a moment, he looked decades younger, as if someone had lifted the weight from his shoulders. Then he let out a short, breathless laugh that sounded almost boyish. 10 o'clock. 10 o'clock, Claire confirmed. I'll be here at 9:55, he promised, still clutching the handkerchief. He lingered a moment, as though words of gratitude weren't enough. Finally, he reached across the counter and pressed her hand between both of his. You don't know what this means. Thank you. When the bell jingled and the door closed behind him, the silence of the bakery felt different. Not empty, expectant. Claire stood for a long moment before exhaling, a long, steady release that seemed to clear the dust of despair from her lungs. She pulled the string of her apron tighter around her waist and walked into the kitchen. From the top shelf above the mixer, she brought down a worn notebook bound in cloth. Its pages smelled faintly of flour and sugar, the edges softened by years of use. Her grandmother's handwriting sprawled across the lines, recipes written in looping script, annotations in the margins. Notes like "Don't rush the frosting" and "Patience is flavor." She flipped until she found the familiar page. Red velvet. The words felt like a promise. Her grandmother had always said, a cake should whisper, not shout. Evelyn's request for a single rose made perfect sense now. It wasn't about grandeur. It was about love distilled into something simple. Claire turned on the oven, the first hum of heat filling the kitchen. She laid out her remaining ingredients, the cocoa powder she'd been saving, the butter wrapped in wax paper, the 2 vanilla beans she'd tucked away like treasure. Special occasion. She realized with a small, wry smile that this was exactly what her grandmother would have called one. She pulled bowls from the shelves, measured flour with care, and began the rhythm she knew better than any other. Whisk, sift, fold, stir. The scent of cocoa bloomed in the air, rich and grounding. Outside, Savannah streets quieted as the city fell deeper into the night. Inside, the little bakery came alive again. For the first time in months, Claire felt the purpose that had first driven her. This wasn't about ledgers or overdue bills or numbers on a screen. It was about giving someone a reason to smile. The work would carry her through the night, and when the morning came, she would place that cake in Thomas Montgomery's hands. And maybe, just maybe, this forgotten cake could mean something more than either of them realized. The kitchen filled with the low hum of the oven, a steady sound that seemed to settle into Claire's bones. She tied her hair back, rolled her sleeves, and set her grandmother's notebook on the counter. The first line of the recipe stared back at her like an instruction from the past: measure with care. Don't rush the soul out of it. She sifted the flour slowly, letting the fine powder fall like snow into the stainless steel bowl. Cocoa followed, rich and earthy, carrying with it the promise of something decadent. When she split open the vanilla bean, the scent rushed out sharp and sweet, filling the air with something she hadn't breathed in months: possibility. The mixer whirred to life, its steady rhythm like a lullaby in reverse, waking her rather than lulling her. The sound echoed through the empty bakery, blending with the quiet pulse of the refrigerator and the faint creak of the old building. Time seemed to dissolve into the motions: crack an egg, fold the mixture, scrape the sides of the bowl. Each gesture, though ordinary, carried the weight of intention. As the batter thickened into a glossy crimson, her mind drifted back to childhood summers in her grandmother's kitchen in South Georgia. She remembered climbing onto a stool, chin barely above the counter, while her grandmother whisked cream in a chipped porcelain bowl. The lace curtains had fluttered in the humid breeze, and sugar dust sparkled in the sunlight. "A cake should whisper, not shout," her grandmother used to say, tapping her wooden spoon against the rim. "If it whispers, people will lean in to listen." Claire smiled faintly as she poured the batter into pans lined with parchment. The oven door closed with a soft thud, and within minutes the warm, bittersweet scent of cocoa began to seep into every corner of the bakery. She leaned against the counter, inhaling deeply, letting the fragrance wrap around her like comfort. It felt like home, the home she thought she had lost when bills and deadlines replaced joy and patience. The hours slipped away in small increments. The ding of the oven timer, the steam rising from freshly baked layers, the coolness of cream cheese frosting whipping into smooth peaks. The world outside the bakery faded. Tourists had long gone to their hotels. Carriages no longer rattled down the cobblestones, and the Spanish moss swayed gently in the midnight breeze. But inside, the bakery pulsed with life again, reborn through each careful step. When the cakes cooled, she trimmed them with a steady hand, brushing crumbs aside. She spread frosting between each layer, pressing them together until they stood firm, each one aligned perfectly on the cardboard round. The final coat of frosting spread across the surface like fresh snow, white and unbroken. Claire smoothed it with long, deliberate strokes, the motion calming, precise. She adjusted the angle of the lamp above her workstation, its warm light spilling across the counter. Then came the rose. She melted sugar in a small saucepan, watching carefully as it turned clear, then amber, before whisking it off the heat at just the right moment. Her grandmother's notes had circled this step 3 times. "Patience here, or you'll lose it." She dipped thin strips, shaped them quickly, each petal fragile enough to tear if her hands faltered. Slowly, she built the bloom, petal upon petal, until a single rose stood at the center of her counter. Delicate, luminous, almost alive. She placed it gently on top of the cake, where it caught the lamplight like glass. By the time dawn touched the windows, Claire stood back and exhaled. On the stand before her was not just a cake, but something far more. A red velvet layered with cream cheese frosting, crowned with a sugar rose that whispered of love, memory, and devotion. The exhaustion she should have felt was absent. Instead, there was only a quiet pride, a sense of purpose she had thought long gone. She slid the cake carefully into a white box, the kind she had saved for weddings that never came. Tying the ribbon felt like sealing something sacred. The bakery was still quiet, but no longer empty. The silence carried weight, expectation, as though the walls themselves were waiting to see what would happen next. At 9:45, the bell above the door chimed softly. Thomas Montgomery entered slowly, his steps cautious but eager. His coat looked heavier in the morning light, his face pale from a sleepless night. When his eyes landed on the box resting on the counter, he froze. Claire lifted the lid gently, revealing the cake. The sunlight from the window struck the sugar rose, making it glisten like dew. For a moment, Thomas simply stared. Then his breath caught, and his eyes filled with tears that spilled before he could stop them. He reached across the counter and grasped her hand with both of his grip firm despite the tremor. His voice, when it came, was hushed, reverent. This is her cake. It's the one she always loved. You don't know what you've done for me." Claire felt her throat tighten, her own eyes stinging. She managed a small nod, unable to speak. In that moment, the debts, the landlord's letters, the bank's warnings, they all faded into the background. What mattered was the man holding her hand and the joy that would light up his wife's face when she saw the cake. Even if Sweet Moment closed its doors forever, even if Monday meant the end of her business, at least this night had been worth it. At least she had remembered why she became a baker. And for the first time in a very long while, Claire allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, her work still had meaning. The Montgomery home was alive with voices and laughter, though beneath the surface there was a current of unease. Relatives filled the living room. Children ran up and down the hallway, their squeals bouncing off the old plaster walls. The dining table groaned under the weight of casseroles, roasted vegetables, a ham glazed to perfection, and bowls of fruit. Wine glasses clinked as adults made conversation, doing their best to keep the atmosphere cheerful. Yet something essential was missing. At the center of the long table, where the crown of the celebration should have stood, there was only an empty space. No cake, no candles, no centerpiece for the milestone they had all gathered to honor. Guests glanced toward it now and then, quickly turning their eyes away, as if refusing to acknowledge the absence would somehow fill it. Evelyn Montgomery sat at the head of the table, a silk shawl draped around her shoulders. Her silver hair had been carefully set that morning, her lipstick a soft rose that brightened her face. She smiled graciously as her grandchildren presented her with handmade cards and little bouquets plucked from the garden. She laughed when one of the boys tried to sneak an extra roll, and she listened patiently as her nieces asked after her health. But her hands betrayed her. They trembled ever so slightly when she lifted her glass. Her eyes, though kind, carried a shadow of disappointment. For 55 years, her birthdays had been marked by the same ritual: a red velvet cake, cream cheese frosting, and a single sugar rose on top. It was not just dessert. It was memory, tradition. The cake was her husband's way of saying, "I remember. I see you. You matter." And this year the table was bare. From across the room, her granddaughter Caroline observed everything with the sharp eye of someone who had built her reputation on noticing details. At 32, she was one of Savannah's most respected food critics, her reviews capable of making or breaking a restaurant. Tonight, however, her pen was nowhere in sight. She was only a granddaughter, standing helpless as she watched her grandmother mask her disappointment with polite laughter. She leaned toward her grandfather earlier in the evening, speaking softly so no one else would hear. "You forgot, didn't you?" she asked. Thomas's face had fallen, guilt carving deeper lines into his already weary features. He gave a small, shameful nod. "I tried, Caro. I swear I tried. Every shop I went to closed or they said no. I failed her." His eyes watered, and Caroline had turned away quickly, not wanting to see the regret written so plainly. Now, as the night wore on, Caroline worried the moment was slipping beyond repair. She imagined her grandmother going to bed with that hollow space in her heart, her 80 years marked by absence rather than joy. The thought made Caroline's stomach twist. Then, just as the air in the room seemed to grow heavier, the front door swung open. Thomas Montgomery stepped inside, breathless, his tweed coat dusted with the chill of the evening air. In his arms, he cradled a large white bakery box tied with string. The room fell silent at once, conversations cut short as every head turned toward him. Even the children froze, sensing the shift. "I found it," Thomas announced, his voice carrying a mixture of relief and pride. "We have a cake." He walked to the table, setting the box gently in the very space that had sat empty all night. His hands lingered on the lid, almost reverent. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The anticipation in the room was palpable, like a collective breath being held. With slow, deliberate care, Thomas untied the string and lifted the lid. Gasps rippled through the crowd. There it was, a red velvet cake of striking beauty, its cream cheese frosting smooth and flawless, white as fresh snow. At the very center rested a single rose crafted from sugar, so delicate it looked as though it had been plucked from a morning garden. Its petals caught the light, translucent and luminous, as if a drop of dew clung to its edge. The cake seemed almost too perfect, too alive to be eaten. Evelyn lifted her hands to her face, her eyes welling instantly. "Oh, Thomas," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's beautiful. It's the most beautiful cake I've ever seen." Tears streamed down her cheeks, but they were not the tears of disappointment she had been holding back all evening. These were tears of joy, of gratitude, of love renewed. She reached out to touch her husband's hand, and he covered hers gently, leaning close enough for only her to hear. "Happy birthday, my love," he murmured. Applause broke out, first tentative and then swelling into full celebration. The children clapped wildly, the adults smiled, some wiping their own eyes. Laughter and cheer filled the house at last, the empty space on the table now transformed into the centerpiece of the night. Caroline stepped forward, her critic's gaze unable to resist a closer inspection. She had spent years tasting the best desserts Savannah had to offer, trained to catch flaws invisible to most. She studied the cake with professional intensity, the evenness of the layers, the smoothness of the frosting, the artistry of the rose. Finally, she accepted a slice and brought the fork to her lips. The first bite stilled her. The cake was moist, tender, with a faint tang of buttermilk balancing the sweetness. The cocoa gave it depth, the cream cheese frosting was tangy and rich, and the sugar rose melted like a whisper on her tongue. But it wasn't just the flavors. It was something else, something intangible, almost spiritual. Caroline lowered her fork slowly, her strict composure faltering. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet but carried through the room. "This isn't just a cake," she said, her eyes still on the slice before her. "This is art." The room hushed again. Family members exchanged looks of surprise. Caroline Montgomery, the critic known for her razor-sharp reviews, rarely gave such praise, even to the city's finest chefs. Evelyn reached for her granddaughter's hand, her smile radiant through her tears. "It's perfect, isn't it?" she said softly. Caroline nodded, her throat tight. "It's more than perfect. It's honest." Thomas looked at her, astonished, then turned his gaze back to the cake, his heart swelling with pride and relief. The forgotten order, the frantic search, the stranger's kindness in a small Savannah bakery. Somehow it had all led here, to this moment of redemption. As the first candles were lit and everyone sang, Evelyn's eyes sparkled brighter than the flames. The cake wasn't simply dessert. It was proof that love, even when nearly forgotten, could still be remembered in the sweetest of ways. And in that crowded dining room, surrounded by family and warmth, no one could deny that a miracle had arrived on the table. Later that night, after the last candles had been blown out and the final slice of cake savored, Caroline Montgomery returned to her apartment downtown. She sat at her desk, the soft light of a lamp illuminating her notebook and laptop. As a critic, she was accustomed to writing with precision, evaluations of flavor, technique, presentation. But tonight, the words came from a different place. She wrote not as a professional detached by duty, but as a granddaughter who had witnessed something profoundly human. Her article began simply, "One forgetful grandfather and the most honest cake in Savannah." She recounted the story of Thomas Montgomery's panic, his late-night search through the city, and the chance encounter with a struggling baker who had chosen compassion over profit. She described the cake in detail, but more than that, she wrote about what it meant. She told of her grandmother's tears, her family's joy, and her own stunned reaction as a critic who had tasted desserts across Europe but had never encountered one so alive. "This cake," she typed, pausing before continuing, "was not just baked. It was given." It was a reminder that food at its best is not decoration or spectacle. It is love in edible form. And when we lose bakers like Claire Bennett, we lose more than a business. We lose a piece of what makes life meaningful. When Caroline hit publish, she had no idea the ripple it would send through the city. By midnight, the article had already spread across Savannah's online community. By dawn, it had been shared hundreds of times on social media, reposted with captions like "This made me cry" and "Support local bakers with soul." Comment sections filled with stories from people who remembered their own family traditions, their own moments when food had spoken louder than words. The next morning, Claire awoke to the shrill buzz of her phone vibrating on the nightstand. At first she groaned, assuming it was another reminder from the bank or a supplier asking for payment. But as she rubbed the sleep from her eyes, she saw notification after notification lighting up the screen. Messages, missed calls, emails. Frowning, she pulled on a sweater and shuffled to the kitchen table, her heart thudding with confusion. She opened her email first. Dozens of subject lines greeted her. Cake order inquiry, wedding tasting request. Do you have availability this month? Some were from names she recognized around Savannah. Others were complete strangers. Her hands trembled as she clicked through them. People weren't just asking for pastries or cupcakes. They were asking for wedding cakes, anniversary cakes, corporate orders, dozens at a time. Still half in disbelief, Claire powered up her old laptop. The fan whined as the screen flickered to life. She typed in her password and waited for the sluggish browser to load. When it finally did, her breath caught. Right there, on the homepage of the city's most read lifestyle site, was Caroline Montgomery's article. The headline stretched across the screen, "One forgetful grandfather and the most honest cake in Savannah." Beneath it, a photo of a sugar rose glistened under the light, delicate and impossible to ignore. Claire leaned closer, reading in stunned silence. Caroline had not only described the cake, she had described her. The late-night hours, the decision to bake when she could have closed the door, the soul she poured into it because she believed food should carry love. Caroline's words were tender but firm, a declaration to the city that bakers like Claire were worth saving. As Claire scrolled, she saw the comment section already teeming with responses. "Where is this bakery?" one person asked. "I'll drive across town for a slice," said another. "I want her to bake my wedding cake," wrote someone else. Others simply left messages of gratitude. "This story made me believe in people again." She covered her mouth with her hand, overwhelmed. The phone rang again, jolting her. She answered, her voice tentative. "Good morning," said a polite male voice on the other end. "I'm calling from Magnolia Catering. We read about you this morning. We'd like to place an order for a corporate event, 50 guests." Before she could process that, another call came in, then another. Texts buzzed. Instagram notifications piled up as strangers tagged her bakery's page. Overnight, her small account had ballooned from a few hundred followers to thousands. She sat there, phone pressed to her ear, staring at the empty shelves behind her counter. Just yesterday, she had been ready to close for good, convinced the city had forgotten her. Now the city seemed to have found her all at once. For a long while, she simply sat at the table, the sunlight warming her face, letting the truth settle in. She wasn't forgotten. She wasn't invisible. Somehow a single cake, baked in desperation, and love had shifted everything. And while the landlord's letter still sat unopened on the counter, and the bank would surely still call, Claire felt something stir deep inside her chest. Something she hadn't felt in months. Hope. By the time the sun dipped below the moss-draped oaks of Savannah, Claire Bennett was nearly undone. The bakery had been filled from the moment she unlocked the door until long past closing time. Customers had streamed in one after another, some holding printed copies of Caroline Montgomery's article, others repeating lines they'd read online. "The most honest cake in Savannah." She had baked and sold until her shelves were stripped bare. Even the jar of stale cookies by the register, which had sat untouched for weeks, was emptied. Now the bakery was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet than the night before. Boxes were stacked haphazardly in the corner. The sink was full of mixing bowls, and the smell of butter and sugar still lingered thick in the air. Claire pulled off her flour-dusted apron and collapsed into one of the wooden chairs near the front window. Her body ached, her feet throbbed, but exhaustion was tempered by something unfamiliar, an undercurrent of wonder. She was about to close her eyes when the bell above the door jingled softly. Claire's head shot up, startled. "I'm sorry," she called automatically, her voice hoarse from the long day. "We're closed for the night." "That's all right," came a warm, measured reply. "I didn't come for pastries." A woman stepped inside, tall, with dark hair pulled neatly back and a long coat draped over her shoulders. Her eyes were sharp, assessing, yet softened by the hint of a smile. She extended a hand. Caroline Montgomery. Claire froze. Recognition came instantly. Her name had been on every headline, every message, every order today. The critic, the granddaughter, the reason her phone hadn't stopped ringing since sunrise. Claire rose awkwardly, wiping her hands on her apron before shaking Caroline's hand. I don't know what to say, she stammered. Maybe start with thank you, Caroline said lightly, though her expression was kind. Then she shook her head. No, I should be the one apologizing. I'm the reason your day turned into a storm. I didn't realize my article would explode like that. Claire gave a faint laugh, still dazed. A storm, yes. I've never seen anything like it. Yesterday, I thought I'd be closing this place for good. Today, I couldn't keep up. She gestured helplessly toward the empty cases. Everything sold out. Caroline glanced around the bakery, her gaze lingering on the chipped paint, the squeaky ceiling fan, the worn linoleum floors. To most, it was just a small, tired shop. But her eyes softened as if she saw something more. May I sit? She asked. Claire nodded, and soon they were both at the small table by the window, steam rising from 2 cups of tea Claire had hastily poured. For a moment, they sat in silence, the hum of the refrigerator filling the space between them. You're talented, Caroline began. Not just skilled, talented. That cake last night wasn't about technique, it was about heart. People tasted it. That's why the story spread. Claire lowered her eyes, embarrassed by the praise. I've always loved baking, but running a business. She shook her head. The bills, the marketing, the bookkeeping. I'm terrible at it. I never wanted to be a businesswoman. I just wanted to make cakes that meant something. Caroline leaned forward, her tone direct but not unkind. That's exactly why you need help. If you keep doing this alone, you'll drown. Orders will pile up, customers will get frustrated, and the very soul that makes your baking special will burn out. Claire's shoulders tensed. The truth in Caroline's words struck deep. She had already felt the exhaustion of one overwhelming day. What would weeks of this be like? Yet the thought of handing control to someone else, of letting the business turn into something she couldn't recognize, terrified her. I can't become a factory, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. That's not who I am. Caroline's expression softened. She reached across the table, her eyes locking on Claire's. I know, and I don't want you to be. Listen to me carefully. I don't want to turn you into a factory. I want to keep your soul in it. The sincerity in her tone disarmed Claire. No one had ever said words like that to her. No landlord, no banker, no supplier. They had only ever talked about numbers, deadlines, and invoices. Caroline was speaking about something else entirely. What are you suggesting? Claire asked cautiously. A partnership, Caroline replied. I'll invest in this bakery. I'll handle the logistics, marketing, orders, scheduling, supplies, staff. You won't have to worry about the things you hate. All I ask is that you keep baking with the same honesty that made that cake what it was. Claire stared at her, stunned. The offer was almost too much to process. Why? She whispered at last. Why would you do this for me? You don't even know me. Caroline smiled faintly. Because I've been searching for something real. I've spent years reviewing restaurants that look perfect but feel empty. Food that photographs beautifully but tastes like nothing. Your cake, it reminded me why I fell in love with food in the first place. I don't want that to disappear. Savannah doesn't want that to disappear. Silence hung between them, thick with possibility. Claire thought of her grandmother's notebook, of the crack in the display glass, of the long nights she had wondered if any of this mattered. For the first time, the path before her didn't look like a dead end. Her chest tightened with fear, but underneath it was a flicker of something brighter. Hope. Slowly she nodded. All right, she said, quietly, almost to herself. Then louder. Yes, I'll do it. Caroline's smile widened as she extended her hand across the table. Claire reached out, and their fingers clasped firmly. That handshake marked the start of something new, not just for the bakery, but for Claire herself. She had thought she was at the end. Instead, she had just turned the page. And as they sat together, the scent of sugar and tea lingering in the air, the future didn't feel frightening anymore. It felt possible. A year later, the bakery on Whitaker Street bore little resemblance to the tired shop that once hovered on the edge of closure. The name Sweet Moment now gleamed in polished lettering above the doorway, the glass spotless, the crack long replaced. Each morning, as the sun rose over Savannah and light filtered through the oaks heavy with Spanish moss, a line had already formed outside the door. Locals, tourists, families, and couples waited patiently, some carrying magazines or clippings with Caroline Montgomery's article folded neatly inside. Inside, the air buzzed with energy. Claire Bennett no longer worked alone. Young apprentices in crisp aprons moved with coordinated care, carrying trays, frosting cakes, kneading dough under her watchful eye. Stainless steel mixers hummed, ovens opened and closed. Timers beeped in a chorus that once would have overwhelmed her. Now it was music. The bakery had expanded, new ovens, larger refrigerators, racks gleaming with fresh pans. Caroline had kept her promise. She had invested, managed the chaos, and turned Claire's fragile dream into something sustainable. Yet nothing essential had changed. The recipes were still Claire's. The standards were still hers. She moved among her apprentices, correcting a wrist angle, steadying a piping bag, tasting a custard. When one of the young bakers grew flustered, smearing frosting unevenly across a layer, Claire placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Slow down," she said softly. "Don't skimp on the soul." Every cake might be someone's most important memory. It had become her mantra, passed down from her grandmother and now etched into the minds of her team. For Claire, baking had never been about volume or speed. It was about reverence for ingredients, for the people who would share each slice, for the love that lived in sugar and flour. The success of Sweet Moment spread far beyond Savannah. Articles appeared in regional magazines, food bloggers lined up for interviews, and wedding planners recommended her cakes as if they were heirlooms. Orders poured in from nearby towns, and once, astonishingly, from Atlanta. But Claire never lost sight of the heart of her work. Each cake still whispered, not shouted. That spring, a familiar name appeared again on her order list. The Montgomery family. Evelyn Montgomery was turning 81, and the family wanted to celebrate in a way that honored the miracle of the year before. This time, the party would not be shadowed by disappointment or forgotten orders. They wanted Claire to create the centerpiece, not as a desperate rescue, but as a cherished tradition. On the day of the celebration, Claire and her team carried the cake carefully into the rented hall where the Montgomery family had gathered. The room glowed with warm light, tables draped in white linens, vases filled with lilies and roses. Children darted between the adults, laughter bouncing off the walls. Then Claire entered, steady hands gripping the stand that bore the cake. Conversations hushed, heads turned. The cake was 3 tiers tall, its cream cheese frosting smooth as porcelain, each edge sharp and elegant. On top, a sugar rose bloomed, delicate and luminous, crafted with the same patience Claire had shown a year ago. The rose seemed to glow under the chandelier, fragile yet eternal. Gasps of admiration rippled through the room. Phones lifted discreetly, trying to capture the perfection. Evelyn, seated near the head of the table, pressed her hand to her chest. Her eyes brimmed with tears before the cake had even reached her. Thomas stood beside her, his posture straighter than it had been in years. As Claire placed the cake carefully on the central table, he cleared his throat. The room quieted at once, as if everyone sensed the gravity of what he wanted to say. "Last year," Thomas began, his voice thick with emotion, "this young woman didn't just save my wife's birthday. She saved our family." The word struck like a bell, reverberating through the gathering. Guests broke into applause, not polite, but thunderous, heartfelt. Evelyn's tears spilled freely, her smile radiant, as she looked from the cake to her husband and then to Claire. Claire, standing there in her flour-dusted apron, felt her throat tighten. The applause, the praise, the spotlight, it was overwhelming. She had never been comfortable with grand gestures. She was a baker, not a performer. Yet in that moment, with dozens of faces turned toward her in gratitude, she felt something shift deep inside. Her eyes glistened, and she lowered her head slightly, blinking back her own tears. She thought of the night when she had almost walked away forever, when the shelves had been empty and her future looked like ash. And she thought of the rose she had placed on that first cake, fragile and trembling in her hands, unaware that it would bloom into this. The applause swelled again as Evelyn reached for Claire's hand. Her grip was surprisingly strong, her voice a whisper, but clear. You gave me back joy, and you gave this family something we'll never forget. Claire could only nod, her heart full. She had baked countless cakes since that night, but this one moment reminded her why she began in the first place. Not for money, not for reputation, but for love. The celebration continued with laughter and music, but the cake remained the centerpiece. Every guest who tasted it murmured in awe, savoring not only the flavor but the story it carried. The 3 tiers were more than layers of sponge and frosting. They were proof that second chances could blossom into legacies. And for Claire, standing quietly at the edge of the room, it was enough. She didn't need more applause. She didn't need more headlines. Seeing Evelyn's tears of joy, hearing Thomas's voice steady with pride, that was everything. In that hall, under the glow of lights and the sound of clinking glasses, Claire Bennett realized she had not only revived a bakery. She had rebuilt a life, one slice at a time. The music had quieted, the last of the guests drifted out into the warm Savannah night, and the Montgomery celebration slowly came to an end. The 3-tiered cake had been reduced to crumbs and satisfied sighs, but its presence still lingered in the glow of the evening. Evelyn Montgomery remained at the head of the table, her shawl draped loosely around her shoulders, her eyes brighter than they had been in years. As Claire began to gather her utensils and prepare to slip quietly out, Evelyn reached for her hand. Her grip, though delicate, carried surprising strength. Claire stopped, startled, and looked down into the elder woman's face. Evelyn's eyes, wet with tears, met hers with unwavering clarity. "Your hands do miracles," she whispered, her voice low but resonant, as if imparting a secret meant only for Claire. "Guard this gift. Don't ever let anyone take it from you." Claire's breath caught. For a moment, she couldn't speak. She simply nodded, pressing Evelyn's hand gently, carrying the weight of those words into her heart. It was a blessing, a charge, and a promise all at once. When she finally stepped out into the night, the air was thick with the scent of magnolias, and the streets hummed with the quiet life of Savannah. She walked slowly back to her bakery, her thoughts circling around the journey that had brought her here. The letters from the landlord, the bank notices, the silent nights in an empty shop. They had nearly convinced her the dream was gone. But standing in that hall tonight, hearing Thomas's voice, feeling Evelyn's hand in hers, she realized something powerful. Dreams didn't die. They simply waited. They waited for faith, for courage, for a chance to be reborn. The following week, Sweet Moment was busier than ever. The story of Evelyn's birthday spread further, adding to the legend that Caroline's article had already ignited. People no longer came just for pastries. They came for the story, for the soul they believed was baked into every crumb. One evening, after the last customer had left and the apprentices had cleaned the counters, Claire found herself sitting across from Caroline in the softly lit bakery. The shop glowed warmly, the display cases gleaming, the scent of vanilla and sugar still thick in the air. Caroline lifted her tea, studying Claire with a satisfied smile. "You realize what you've built, don't you?" Claire shook her head, half laughing. "I didn't build this alone. You pushed me. You believed in me when I didn't." I only held up a mirror, Caroline replied. You were always this. You just needed the world to see it. Through the front windows, they could see the silhouettes of people already forming a line outside. Some leaned against the lampposts, chatting softly, while others peeked inside with eager anticipation. It wasn't morning yet, but they were willing to wait. Sweet Moment had become more than a bakery. It had become a destination. Claire leaned back in her chair, letting the sight wash over her. The neon sign above the door glowed in the night, casting its warm light over the faces gathered outside. A year ago, the same windows had reflected only emptiness. Now they reflected community, hope, and the living proof that her grandmother had been right all along. A cake should whisper, not shout. She looked at Caroline and said softly, almost as if reminding herself, a single cake can change a life when it's made with love. Caroline nodded, her critic's sharpness softened by something gentler. And sometimes it changes more than one. Just then, the bell above the door jingled, clear and bright, echoing through the quiet shop. Claire turned toward the sound, her heart leaping in recognition. That simple chime, once a sound of anxiety of uncertain customers and meager sales, now rang like a promise. It was the sound of beginnings, of opportunities, of a future unfolding. Claire smiled, rising from her chair as the door opened and the night air rushed in. Outside, the line shifted forward, the hum of voices rising with anticipation. Inside, Sweet Moment stood ready, its ovens warm, its counters shining, its soul intact. And as the bell settled back into silence, Claire Bennett knew with absolute certainty, this was only the beginning.
The world keeps turning, and with each turn comes a new story. When one door closes, another opens, leading us into a journey entirely different. Let us set aside the echoes of the tale just past and step together into a new realm where another destiny awaits to be told. And now I invite you to listen to the second story, A Path of Its Own, unrelated to what came before, yet filled with mysteries and surprises meant only for those willing to journey onward with me.
I grabbed my car keys from the kitchen counter, already running late. The small battery icon on the fob flashed red. Of course, it had to be today. Today of all days, when the state labor inspectors were scheduled to visit our company, and as the head of HR, I needed to be there early. I tried prying open the key fob with my nails, but the back cover wouldn't budge. Seriously, I muttered, looking around for a screwdriver. We always had spare batteries in the top drawer of the living room cabinet, at least we used to. I pulled the box out and shuffled through old cables, light bulbs, and random screws. No batteries. None. A knot of frustration twisted in my chest. I didn't have time for this. Maybe Daniel had some in his toolbox on the balcony. He always kept a stash of odds and ends out there. Screwdrivers, wire, duct tape, things he used maybe once a year but swore were essential. I slid open the balcony door, shivering slightly at the sharp morning air. The small cabinet sat in the corner, dusty and jammed with his tools. I yanked open the drawer, and it nearly came off its rails, spilling contents across the floor. Electrical tape, loose screws, a measuring tape, and no batteries. But something else caught my eye. A simple blue notebook, the kind you'd buy in any convenience store, only it didn't belong there. Daniel was not a write in a notebook kind of man. He used apps, notes on his phone, spreadsheets on his laptop. Seeing that little notebook tucked among tools felt strange, out of place. I picked it up, meaning only to move it aside, but curiosity whispered. I hesitated. It's his, I thought. Private. But my eyes betrayed me. The first page was titled, Winter Clothing Kids. Beneath, an itemized list, puffer coats, hats, mittens, thermal underwear, socks, each one neatly checked with quantities next to them. 2 sets of everything. I frowned, flipping another page. Christmas gifts ideas, plush toys, trains, art supplies, Barbie family set, a programmable robot, wireless headphones. Another page showed numbers for a pediatric dentist, a school prep center, and even a private tutor. My breath caught. What is this? These entries went back 5 years, long before Daniel and I married. His first notes predated me entirely. And recently, just days ago, there were more lists. Christmas gifts again, summer clothing, vacation packing lists. A horrible thought flashed like lightning. Daniel had children I didn't know about. A secret family? I tried to reason with myself. Maybe they were for a friend's kids, maybe for charity. But every instinct screamed otherwise. He had never mentioned children, not even once. And yet, these lists were detailed, meticulous, tender in their way. I thought of all those business trips he took every summer, always somewhere coastal, always refusing to take me because it's all work, no free time. Was that true? Or was he taking them? I clutched the notebook, suddenly aware of my breathing. Quick, shallow. Daniel was the most transparent man I had ever known. He smiled easily, helped anyone who asked, always came home on time, never hid his phone or passwords. I trusted him completely. And yet, this notebook felt like another life entirely. I checked my watch. I was supposed to be at work already, meeting the inspectors before anyone else even clocked in. Instead, I was standing barefoot on the balcony, holding evidence. Evidence of what? Exactly, I didn't know yet, but it felt like betrayal. I set the notebook on the kitchen table and sat down, my fingers trembling slightly. I didn't want to read more. I didn't want to invade his privacy further. But the curiosity, the fear, they were stronger than my resolve. I skimmed more pages, each one a punch to the gut. Summer lists with swimsuits, inflatable armbands, sunscreen, little kids' medicine kits with doses carefully noted. I could see him writing these things, thinking ahead, caring for someone. Children. My chest tightened. Daniel knew I couldn't have kids. I told him that before we married, my voice shaking with shame, expecting him to leave. But he didn't. He took my hands, looked me straight in the eye and said, "I love you. We'll make our own kind of family." And yet here it was, his other life, a life with kids that weren't mine. Maybe they weren't even his. But then why keep it a secret? I stared at the notebook, heart pounding. I couldn't wait until tonight. I needed answers now. I called my boss, voice shaky, claiming I was sick. She wasn't happy but agreed to cover for me. Then I placed the notebook right in the center of the table. If he wanted to hide this, he couldn't anymore. I'd wait for him to come home, and finally I'd know the truth. Waiting for Daniel to come home, I couldn't stop staring at that blue notebook on the kitchen table. But my thoughts spiraled far beyond its pages. They drifted back to a life I thought I'd buried long ago. I grew up in a small town in upstate New York where everyone knew everyone, and secrets didn't stay secret for long. My parents raised me to believe in hard work and decency. I wanted to make them proud, to be someone who gave back. That's why I became a teacher. First grade, bright-eyed kids learning how to read and write, tying their shoes, laughing at my silly songs. But the truth? I wasn't cut out for it. I loved the children, but the endless noise, the constant pressure, the heartbreaking stories of kids who came to school hungry, it all ate away at me. I went home every day, exhausted and doubting myself. So, after 3 years, I quit. My parents were surprised, even disappointed. But I told myself it was temporary, that I'd find another way to make a difference. I moved to the city and landed a job in human resources. It was supposed to be stable, professional, safe. And then I met him. He wasn't Daniel. He was someone else, someone who seemed charming at first. We went on a few dates, and I let myself fall too fast. I was lonely, eager to prove I could have a normal life like everyone else. When he said he was separated from his wife, I believed him, or maybe I just wanted to. 2 months later, I found out I was pregnant. The night I told him, expecting shock, but maybe even joy, he laughed. "Amanda, I have a wife and 2 kids. I'm not leaving them. You knew what this was." No, I hadn't known. I'd built my future in my head, and in one sentence he crushed it. I sat in my apartment all night, staring at the walls, my hands over my stomach. I wanted to keep the baby. I wanted to believe I could do it alone. but I was barely surviving paycheck to paycheck, renting a tiny one-bedroom, no support system in the city. And I couldn't bear the thought of going back to my hometown as the girl who got pregnant by a married man. So I made the hardest decision of my life. The procedure didn't go smoothly. Complications set in, a raging infection, emergency surgery, and then the words from the doctor that hollowed me out completely. You won't be able to carry children again. I'm sorry. For weeks, I stayed inside, barely eating, crying until I couldn't cry anymore. I hated myself, hated the choices I'd made, hated the silence in that apartment. I promised I'd never let myself be vulnerable like that again. Years later, when I met Daniel, I carried that shame like a stone in my chest. We met at work. He was consulting for our IT department. He had this calm, steady energy, like nothing could shake him. I told him about my infertility before things got serious, expecting him to walk away. But he didn't. He squeezed my hand and said, Amanda, I'm with you because of who you are, not because of what you can or can't give me. That was the moment I fell in love for real. He made me believe I could still have a family, our own version of it. Pets, maybe adoption someday, or simply each other. I thought we were honest with each other. I thought there were no secrets. And yet that notebook, those names, those lists, that secret life. I glanced at the clock. Daniel wouldn't be home for another 3 hours. My heart thudded like a drum as I tried to distract myself with chores, but I couldn't shake the thought. What if he has children and I never knew? What if he chose me because I can't give him what she did? I pressed my hands to my face, trying to breathe. I had sworn I'd never feel that kind of betrayal again, but here I was, bracing myself for answers I might not be ready to hear. For a moment, I wished I'd never found that notebook at all. The apartment felt unnervingly quiet. No television, no music, not even the hum of the dishwasher I usually left running after dinner. I had turned everything off, as if silence itself could help me think. The blue notebook sat squarely in the middle of the kitchen table, its pages closed but heavy with meaning. I had placed it there deliberately, almost like evidence in plain sight. When Daniel came home, he would see it. He would know I'd read it, and then there would be no turning back. I tried to busy myself. I wiped the counters twice, then rearranged the spice rack, then put it back the way it was. Every few minutes, I found my gaze drifting to the clock. 3:30 p.m., 4:10 p.m., 4:52 p.m. I still had nearly an hour to go before Daniel's shift ended. Part of me wanted to run, to avoid whatever truth waited for me. I could already hear the explanations, ones I wouldn't believe, ones that would only cut deeper. Another part of me wanted to call him right now, demand answers over the phone, rip the bandage off quickly. But I didn't. I waited. My thoughts wouldn't stay still. They kept flashing back to every business trip Daniel had taken over the last 3 years. Trips where he insisted there was no time for me to come along. Trips where he came back looking tired, but oddly softer. Was he spending that time with children? With her children? I stared at my hands on the countertop, remembering how he held them the day I told him I couldn't have kids. Amanda, that doesn't change how I feel about you, he said back then. I believed him. I still wanted to believe him. But the lists in that notebook, they weren't for charity. They were personal. My phone buzzed. A text. Daniel, on my way. You okay? I stared at the message for a long moment before typing back, yeah. We need to talk. The dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again, then nothing. No reply. At 5:45, I heard the familiar sound of keys at the door. My heart pounded, so hard it felt like it would break my ribs. I gripped the edge of the counter as Daniel stepped inside, his usual warm smile fading when he saw my face and then the notebook on the table. He froze. For a second, I saw something in his eyes, panic maybe or guilt. He set his bag down slowly, cautiously, like someone approaching a wild animal. You found it, he said quietly. I nodded, my voice trembling. Daniel, what is this? These lists, these kids' clothes, toys, Dentist numbers. Who are they for? He didn't answer right away. He just stared at the notebook, his shoulders sagging as if carrying an invisible weight. Then, finally, he met my eyes. It's a long story, he said softly. One I should have told you a long time ago. He pulled out a chair and sat down, clasping his hands together. For the first time since I'd known him, he looked older, tired, vulnerable. Please, Amanda, let me explain. I sank into the chair across from him, my pulse still thundering in my ears. I braced myself, knowing whatever came next would change everything. Daniel's hands trembled slightly as he opened the notebook, flipping through pages like they belonged to someone else. He stopped at one and pressed his fingers on it for a moment, almost as if bracing himself. I should have told you this before we ever got married, he said quietly. But I didn't because I was afraid you'd see me differently, and because part of me never really believed it would still matter. Daniel, my voice was softer than I expected. Just tell me. He took a deep breath, eyes fixed on the table. Her name was Emily Hartman. I met her when I was fresh out of college, working at a coffee shop while I waited for my first IT contract. She was smart, funny, stubborn in the best way, and beautiful. She made me feel like I could do anything. I felt a sting of jealousy, sharp and uninvited, but I stayed quiet. We dated for almost 2 years, he continued. But Emily's life wasn't easy. Her grandmother raised her and money was always tight. When her grandmother's health got worse, the medical bills started piling up. I was trying, Amanda. I really was. But I was just a kid with a part-time job and student loans. He exhaled slowly. She met someone else, a wealthy man. Sergey. He offered to take care of her, to pay for her grandmother's treatment, to give her a life she thought I couldn't. She married him? I asked. Daniel nodded. She did, and it broke me. But I told myself she deserved stability, that maybe he could give her something I couldn't. His voice cracked slightly. Only it wasn't stability. Sergey was controlling, jealous, and dangerous. For a while, I didn't know. She stopped contacting me after she married him. I figured she was happy. I folded my hands, heart heavy. What happened? 3 years ago, I saw her again by accident, Daniel said, his eyes distant, lost in memory. She was at the grocery store with 2 kids, Liam and Chloe. Her face lit up when she saw me, but then I saw something else in her eyes, fear. That night, she called me. She said Sergey had been hurting her, that she wanted to leave but didn't know how. She begged me not to tell anyone. I covered my mouth, my chest tight. Daniel! She said she'd call again, but she never did. A month later, she was gone. He swallowed hard, staring down at his hands. Sergey killed her, claimed it was an accident during a fight, but the jury didn't buy it. He's serving a life sentence now. And those kids, they were suddenly orphans. Her grandmother was too old to manage them on her own. So you stepped in, I whispered, glancing at the notebook. Yes. He nodded, tears pooling in his eyes. Not as their father, I'm not. But I felt responsible. I couldn't save Emily, Amanda, but I could at least make sure her kids had coats in the winter, toys at Christmas, school supplies. I send money. I visit when I can. I take them on trips during the summer so their grandmother can rest. It's not about guilt anymore, it's about them. Liam and Chloe didn't ask for any of this. I stared at him, my heart torn in two. One part of me understood the compassion, the loyalty. The other part hurt. Hurt because I'd never known, because all those times I'd asked about his summer trips, he'd smiled and said, "Just work." "You should have told me," I said finally, my voice barely a whisper. "I know." He wiped his eyes. "I was scared. I thought maybe you'd see it as betrayal. I didn't want you to think I was living some double life." I looked at the notebook again, then back at him. "Were you still in love with her?" Daniel's gaze met mine, steady despite the tears. "No. I loved her once, yes, but she made her choice and I moved on. I built a life with you because I love you, Amanda. That hasn't changed." I wanted to believe him. I really did. But my chest still ached, filled with questions and insecurities. Why hide it if there was nothing to hide? Why keep those lists secret? I can't have kids, Daniel. The words slipped out before I could stop them. You knew that, and you said it didn't matter. But all this time, you were spending summers with someone else's children. Do you have any idea how that feels? He leaned forward, voice breaking. Amanda, please, it's not about replacing something I don't have with you. It's about doing what's right for them. I thought protecting you from that past would make things easier, but I see now it just made it worse. The silence between us was heavy, filled with all the things I wanted to say, but couldn't. I closed my eyes, taking a shaky breath. I need time, Daniel. I need to think. He nodded slowly, pain etched across his face. Take all the time you need. I'll tell you everything, every detail if that's what it takes. No more secrets. Just don't give up on us, okay? I didn't answer right away. My hands were cold, trembling. My life had changed in the span of one conversation, and I wasn't sure yet how to feel about it. After Daniel's confession, the apartment felt colder, as if the truth itself had sucked the warmth out of the room. He sat there silently, eyes on me, waiting for a response that wouldn't come. I finally stood, my legs shaky, and walked into the bedroom. I closed the door and leaned against it, sliding down until I sat on the floor. My hands were trembling, my pulse still pounding like I had just run a marathon. I'd asked for honesty, and I got it, but the truth felt heavier than the lie ever had. Emily Hartman. The name echoed in my mind like a ghost. She was dead, and yet she was here in my home, in my marriage, in the way Daniel had kept his summer secret. She was everywhere, and I hated that I envied a woman who wasn't even alive. I stood and stared at myself in the mirror above the dresser. My eyes were red, my face pale. I whispered to my reflection, "You're being ridiculous, Amanda. He didn't cheat on you. He didn't lie about loving you." My voice cracked. He just never let you in. That was the part that cut the deepest. Not that he'd helped children who needed him, but that he'd faced it alone, as if I couldn't handle his past, as if I wasn't strong enough to carry it with him. But deep down, I wondered if maybe he was right. Because as soon as I saw those lists, all I could think about was what I couldn't give him. Children, family, the things he clearly cherished enough to keep showing up for, even if they weren't his. I pressed a hand against my stomach, the old wound flaring to life. I remembered that cold clinic room, the smell of antiseptic, the way the doctor looked at me after the surgery. "You won't be able to carry children again." I'm sorry. Back then, I thought I'd lost a future. Daniel had been the one who convinced me I still had one, that we could create a life built on love, not biology. I'd believed him. And now I couldn't stop picturing him holding Liam's hand at the beach, Chloe riding on his shoulders. I could see them laughing, bonding, making memories. A family, even if it wasn't legally his, and definitely not mine. I wiped my eyes and stepped out of the bedroom. Daniel was still at the kitchen table, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. He looked up when he heard me. "Amanda," his voice was rough. "Please say something." I swallowed hard. I don't even know where to start. He stood slowly. "Start anywhere. Yell at me. Throw something if you need to. Just don't shut me out." But I couldn't yell. I couldn't even summon anger. Only a dull ache in my chest. "You built this entire second life," I said quietly, "and you didn't think I should be a part of it." Daniel winced. "That's not what I meant. I thought I was sparing you pain." I shook my head. "You didn't spare me anything. You made me wonder if I was enough." His face crumpled. "Amanda, you are enough. You've always been enough. I love you. Then why didn't you trust me with this?" My voice cracked, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. He stepped closer, but I raised a hand, keeping distance between us. I wasn't ready to be touched, not yet. "I need space," I whispered. Daniel nodded, slowly, eyes shining. "Take it. I'll do whatever you need. Just please don't give up on us." I turned away, gripping the doorframe for balance, my chest tight. I didn't want to give up. I loved him, but love didn't erase the sting of secrets. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the blue notebook still on the table, like a silent witness. My thoughts swirled with jealousy, grief, and something else I couldn't name. A tiny spark of curiosity about those kids. Liam and Chloe. What did they think of Daniel? Did they love him? Did they call him Dad? And what would they think of me? Sleep never came. Instead, I made a decision I wasn't sure I'd regret. I would meet them. I needed to see for myself what kind of life Daniel had been living without me. The next morning, Daniel hesitated when I told him I wanted to meet them. He searched my face for anger, for bitterness, but all he found was resolve. "You don't have to do this," he said softly. "I do," I replied. "If we're going to move forward, I need to know them. And I need to see for myself what all this means to you." We drove in silence along the coastal road toward Portland. The October air was crisp, the ocean visible beyond stretches of pine and rocky shoreline. I tried to focus on the beauty outside, but my mind kept returning to that blue notebook and all the emotions it had unearthed. Daniel's hand rested on the gearshift, fingers twitching like he wanted to take mine, but wasn't sure if he was allowed. I didn't reach for him. Not yet. When we pulled into a quiet suburban neighborhood, my stomach tightened. A small white house sat at the end of a narrow street, a garden full of late-blooming mums lining the walkway. On the porch stood an older woman, frail but upright, her silver hair pulled into a neat bun. She waved as we parked. "That's Margaret," Daniel said. "Emily's grandmother." Margaret smiled as we approached, her eyes kind despite the deep lines of age and grief. "Daniel," she greeted warmly before turning to me, "and you must be Amanda." I nodded, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's nice to meet you." Inside, the house smelled of cinnamon and laundry soap. Toys were scattered in a corner of the living room, and crayon drawings covered one wall. A small voice called out from the hallway, "Uncle Daniel." A boy, Liam, raced into the room, about 6 years old, all energy and bright blue eyes. He wrapped his arms around Daniel's waist. Daniel crouched to hug him, his face softening in a way I'd never seen before. And then a smaller figure peeked from behind the couch. Chloe, 4 years old, curly brown hair framing her round face. She clutched a stuffed rabbit and stared at me with wide, cautious eyes. Daniel smiled gently at her. "Come say hi, Chloe. This is Amanda." For a moment, she hesitated. Then, slowly, she stepped forward, still clutching the rabbit. She looked up at me, her eyes full of quiet uncertainty, and whispered, "Hi." "Hi, Chloe." I knelt so we were eye level. "I love your bunny. What's his name?" Her lips curved in a shy smile. "Mr. Buttons." "That's a perfect name," I said, and something in her face softened. She reached out, small fingers brushing against my hand before slipping into it. It was such a simple gesture, but it pierced straight through my chest. This tiny, hesitant child was letting me in, even just a little. Margaret watched quietly, her hands clasped. "They've been through a lot," she said softly, "but Daniel has been a blessing. I don't know what I'd do without him." I looked at Daniel, who was now listening intently as Liam explained how he'd built a Lego spaceship. He wasn't just helping them out of guilt. He loved these kids. That much was obvious. And for the first time, I didn't feel jealous. I just felt sad. Sad for Emily, for these children, for Daniel who had carried this responsibility alone, and even for myself, because I'd spent so much time fearing the past that I hadn't seen the present clearly. Later, in the backyard, Chloe tugged at my sleeve. "Will you come back?" she asked softly, eyes big and earnest. I blinked back tears. "If it's okay with you, I'd like to." She smiled, and for a moment it felt like something inside me cracked open. Not broken, just open. When we left that afternoon, the car ride was different. Daniel reached for my hand again, and this time I let him hold it. "I'm sorry I kept this from you," he said quietly. I squeezed his hand. "We'll figure it out together." And for the first time since finding that notebook, I actually believed it. The following weeks were quieter between Daniel and me. But it wasn't the silence of distance anymore. It was the kind of silence that comes when you're learning to listen again. We started spending more weekends in Portland, sometimes taking Margaret out for lunch, sometimes just giving her a break while we stayed with the kids. I had expected awkwardness, maybe even resistance, but Liam and Chloe took to me faster than I imagined. The first time Liam called me by name, I felt a strange warmth in my chest. The first time Chloe reached for my hand without hesitation, that warmth deepened. One Saturday morning, we all gathered in Margaret's kitchen to bake cookies. Liam measured flour with too much enthusiasm, covering the counter in white dust, while Chloe carefully placed chocolate chips, one by one, into the bowl. Daniel stood behind me, laughing when I got a smear of dough on my cheek. I caught his smile out of the corner of my eye. It wasn't the guilty, nervous smile he'd worn when I first discovered the notebook. It was soft, grateful, almost relieved. "You're really good with them," he said quietly, his voice carrying something tender. I shrugged, fighting back emotion. I didn't think I would be. I paused, swallowing hard. I thought seeing them would hurt more than it does. But it doesn't, Daniel. It feels right. He reached for my flour-dusted hand and squeezed. "They like you, Amanda, more than you know." Later, as the cookies baked and the house filled with warm, sweet air, Chloe climbed onto my lap with a coloring book. She held up a crayon drawing for figures standing under a bright sun. One tall man, one older woman, a small girl, and a boy. And next to them, a woman with long hair holding the girl's hand. "That's you," Chloe said shyly, pointing to the woman in the drawing. "You're part of our family now." Something inside me broke wide open. I had spent so long believing I could never be a mother, that my chance at family had ended in a sterile clinic years ago. Yet here I was holding a little girl who saw me as hers, and it felt real. Daniel crouched beside us, his hand resting lightly on my back. His voice was low, full of something I couldn't quite name. "Amanda, I know this wasn't the life you pictured. It's not what I pictured either, but maybe this is better." I looked at him, then at Chloe, then at Liam spinning in circles in the living room with a paper airplane, and I knew he was right. This wasn't the family I had imagined, but maybe it was exactly the one I needed. That night, on the drive home, Daniel reached for my hand again, and this time I held on tightly, not because I was afraid of losing him, but because I wanted to hold this moment, this feeling of quiet belonging. For the first time in years, I didn't feel broken. I didn't feel like the woman who couldn't have children or the woman haunted by past mistakes. I felt like someone who had stepped into something bigger than herself, something healing. When we got home, Daniel pulled me into an embrace and whispered, "Thank you for giving them a chance, and for giving me one too." I rested my head on his shoulder and let out a long breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. "I'm done running from the past, Daniel. Let's just be here now." And for the first time, I really meant it. Months passed, and what had once felt like an exposed wound slowly became something softer, something I could hold without pain. We visited Liam and Chloe almost every weekend. Sometimes Daniel took them to the park while I stayed back with Margaret, sipping tea as she shared stories of Emily's childhood, the bright, stubborn girl who loved books and hated carrots. Other times, we all piled into the kitchen again to bake, or bundled up to walk along the rocky coast. It wasn't long before the kids began to treat me like I'd always been there. Liam proudly showed me every Lego masterpiece, every drawing from school. Chloe climbed into my lap at Storytime without hesitation, resting her head on my shoulder as if it had always been her place. The first time she called me Mommy, it wasn't dramatic or planned. She was tired, eyes heavy, as I carried her up the stairs to bed. "Good night, Mommy," she mumbled sleepily, not even realizing what she'd said. I froze, heart swelling so fast it hurt. Daniel saw the look on my face and just smiled softly, his eyes shining. He didn't correct her. Neither did I. On the drive home that night, I turned to Daniel. I thought I'd lost my chance to be a mom forever, I admitted quietly. But somehow, I didn't. It just looks different than I imagined. He squeezed my hand, his voice warm and certain. That's because you didn't lose anything, Amanda. You gained something new. And he was right. The truth is, healing rarely looks like we think it will. Sometimes it isn't about getting back what was lost. It's about finding something unexpected, something you never even knew you needed. I still carry my past with me. The mistakes, the heartbreak, the day a doctor told me I'd never have children of my own. But now, when I think of the future, I don't feel that hollow ache anymore. I feel Liam's small hand slipping into mine. I hear Chloe's giggle as she colors outside the lines. I see Daniel looking at me not with guilt or secrets, but with gratitude and love. This isn't the life I thought I'd have, but it's the one I'm thankful for every single day. So if you're listening to this and you're holding on to an old hurt, afraid you'll never be whole again, maybe the path to healing isn't about going back. Maybe it's about looking forward, about opening your heart to something different, something better. Because sometimes family isn't who you're born to, it's who you choose. And I choose this one.